Chosen by Wolf's Mark. Evan Corbin had never questioned why her mother warned her to stay indoors during an eclipse. But when the sky darkened and the ground beneath her feet sighed, she knew she had made a mistake. The air shimmered like heat on a summer road. The torches along the village square flared blue. And then he appeared golden-eyed, unreadable, his voice curling against her skin like a spell. "You've crossed the threshold," he murmured. "Now, the moon will decide what to do with you." Chapter 1. The Eclipse and the Stranger. The afternoon had begun like any other in the sleepy village of Oakhaven. Evan Corbin, a woman who carried her 58 years with a quiet grace that belied the storm she'd weathered, was tending to her small herb garden. The rosemary and lavender, bathed in the unusually warm October sun, released their fragrant oils into the air, a familiar comfort. She hummed a tuneless melody, her fingers, gnarled with age and experience, gently plucking the dead leaves from a thriving sage bush. Her life, since the death of her husband, Thomas, 5 years prior, had been a tapestry woven with threads of quiet routine and bittersweet memories. The air, however, held a strange stillness, a pregnant pause that even the bees seemed to acknowledge, their buzzing fading to a near-silent hum. Evan straightened, a slight ache in her lower back a familiar companion, and glanced at the sky. A hazy, almost imperceptible darkening was creeping across the sun's surface. She frowned. An eclipse. Her mother's warnings, dismissed for decades as old wives' tales, suddenly echoed in her mind. Never, Evan, never be caught outside during an eclipse. The veil thins, child. And things can cross over. Evan had always scoffed, internally, of course. Her mother, a woman steeped in folklore and the whispered traditions of their secluded valley, had a penchant for the dramatic. Yet, a prickle of unease danced on her skin. She gathered her basket of herbs, intending to head inside, when the ground beneath her feet did something unexpected. It sighed. A low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth. The air shimmered, distorting the familiar view of the village square. The torches, lit early in anticipation of the evening market, flared with an unnatural, vibrant blue flame. The villagers, usually bustling with activity, froze, their faces a mixture of confusion and growing fear. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Evan, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, felt a pull, an invisible force drawing her gaze towards the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel in the center of the square. And then he appeared. He materialized from the shimmering air, as if stepping through a tear in reality. He was tall, impossibly so, with a presence that commanded attention. His hair, the color of dark, aged wood, was pulled back from a face that seemed both sculpted and wild, his features sharp and defined. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of molten gold, luminous and intense, radiating a power that felt both ancient and utterly terrifying. They scanned the square, assessing, judging, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, they locked onto hers. He moved with a fluid grace that defied his size, closing the distance between them in a few silent strides. The villagers, normally so bold and boisterous, seemed to shrink back, creating a wide berth around him. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the blue flames and the frantic beat of Avant's own heart. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the subtle heat radiating from his body, a warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. His scent was unfamiliar, a complex blend of pine needles, damp earth, and something else. Something primal, something that triggered a deep, instinctive fear within her. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. It curled around her, smooth and dangerous, like a silken noose. "You've crossed the threshold," he murmured, his golden eyes boring into hers, seeing past her age, past her wrinkles, past the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart. He saw her. "Now, the moon will decide what to do with you." Evan tried to speak, to protest, to demand an explanation, but her voice caught in her throat. Her mind, usually so sharp and practical, was reeling. This was impossible. This was the stuff of her mother's fantastical stories, not the reality of her quiet, predictable life. She felt a strange mixture of terror and something else. A flicker of something that felt alarmingly like curiosity. He tilted his head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, as if studying her reaction. A faint, ghost of a smile played on his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't be afraid, Evan the Corbin," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Fear is a wasted emotion." His use of her name, spoken with such familiarity by a complete stranger, sent another shiver down her spine. She finally found her voice, though it trembled slightly. Who are you? What threshold? What do you mean the moon will decide?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out, his hand, large and strong, hovering just inches from her face. She flinched, instinctively, but didn't pull away. His fingers, long and elegant, brushed a stray strand of graying hair from her cheek, the touch sending an unexpected jolt of electricity through her. It wasn't a threatening gesture, yet it felt profoundly intimate, a claiming of sorts. "My name is Reese," he finally said, his voice still low, still carrying that undercurrent of power. "And as for the threshold, you'll understand soon enough. The eclipse, it opens doors, Evan, the doors that are usually kept tightly shut." He paused, his golden eyes searching hers. "And you, my dear, have inadvertently walked through one." The blue flames of the torches pulsed, casting dancing shadows that played across Reese's face, making him appear even more otherworldly. The villagers remained frozen, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Evan felt a growing sense of unreality, as if she had stepped into a dream that was both terrifying and strangely alluring. She looked at Reese, at his intense gaze, at the power that radiated from him, and a terrifying thought took root in her mind. Her life, the quiet, predictable life she had known, was over. The eclipse had changed everything. And this man, this Reese, was at the center of it all. He held her gaze, a silent promise of something unknown hanging heavy in the air between them. What would become of her now? Chapter 2. Whispers of the Moonbound. The silence that followed Reese's pronouncements was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling of the unnaturally blue torches and the distant, panicked whinny of a horse. Evan, still reeling from the encounter, felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a distance. The villagers, her neighbors, her friends, were frozen in place, their faces pale and etched with fear. She saw old Mrs. Henderson, usually so quick with a smile and a gossip, clutching her rosary beads, her lips moving in silent prayer. Young Thomas, the blacksmith's son, a boy on the cusp of manhood, stood rigid, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at his belt. Reese, oblivious to the fear he inspired, or perhaps reveling in it, remained motionless, his golden eyes still locked on Evance. The air around him seemed to shimmer, a subtle distortion that only she seemed to notice. It was as if he existed on a different plane, a being of myth and legend suddenly made real. The scent of pine and earth intensified, mingling with that other, wilder scent that sent a shiver of primal apprehension through her. Finally, breaking the spell, a voice called out, hesitant and trembling. "Reese, is that truly you?" It was Elder Silas, the village leader, a man known for his calm demeanor and unwavering faith. He stepped forward, his wrinkled face etched with disbelief and a dawning horror. Reese turned his head, slowly, deliberately, his golden eyes sweeping over the elder. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Silas," he acknowledged, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in the very air. "It has been a long time. But how? We were told you were gone. Lost to the Shadowlands." Silas stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Reese chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Lost? Perhaps. But not gone. The moon, old friend, has a long memory, and it remembers its promises. Evan, her mind still struggling to grasp the reality of the situation, felt a growing sense of unease. Shadowlands? Promises? What were they talking about? She looked from Rhys to Silas, searching for answers in their faces, but found only more questions. Silas took another hesitant step forward. What do you want? Why have you returned? Rhys's gaze shifted back to Evan. I have returned for her, he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. She is moonbound. The eclipse has marked her. The word moonbound sent a ripple of fear through the villagers. Whispers broke out, hushed and frantic. Evan had heard the term before, in hushed tones, in stories told late at night, tales meant to frighten children. The moonbound, those touched by the moon's power, those who walked between worlds, those who were different. Moonbound? Silas repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. But she's one of us. She's Evan the Corbin, Thomas's widow. Rhys's expression remained unchanged. She was Evan a Corbin. Now she is something more. Something destined. He reached out, his hand hovering near her arm, but not quite touching. The moon has chosen her, and I am here to guide her. Evan felt a surge of defiance. Chosen me? For what? I don't understand. I'm just an old woman. A widow. I don't want any part of this. Rhys's golden eyes softened, just slightly. You have no choice, Evan. The moon's pull is not something you can resist. It is in your blood, in your soul. It has been dormant, waiting for this moment, for this eclipse, to awaken. But what does it mean? She pleaded, her voice trembling. What will happen to me? Rhys's gaze was intense, unwavering. It means you will learn the truth about yourself, about your heritage, about the power that lies within you. It means you will face trials, dangers, unlike anything you have ever imagined. But it also means you will no longer be alone. The last words, spoken with a surprising tenderness, sent a shiver through her. Alone. It was a word that resonated deeply within her, a word that echoed the emptiness she had felt since Thomas's death. For years, she had wrapped herself in solitude, in routine, in the familiar comfort of her garden. But now, this stranger, this being of myth and legend, was offering her something different. A chance to escape the loneliness, to embrace a destiny she never knew existed. But at what cost? The fear in the villagers' eyes was a stark reminder that this path, this destiny, was not without its dangers. The whispers of Moonbound carried with them tales of madness, of transformation, of a loss of self. Was she willing to risk everything, to step into the unknown, guided by a man she didn't trust, a man who radiated a power that both terrified and intrigued her? Rhys seemed to sense her hesitation. He lowered his hand, the unspoken offer of connection withdrawn. You have time, Evan, he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. The moon's influence is strongest now, during the eclipse, but it will linger. I will remain in the village. You will find me when you are ready. He paused, his golden eyes holding hers. Or, he added, a hint of challenge in his voice, you can try to run. But the moon, Evan, will always find you. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the deepening shadows of the encroaching twilight. The blue flames of the torches flickered and died, returning to their normal, yellow glow. The villagers slowly began to disperse, their whispers following Evan as she stood there, alone in the center of the square, the weight of Rhys's words, the weight of the moon's unseen presence, pressing down on her. The eclipse was ending, but her world had just begun to change. What would she do? Chapter 3. The Village of Whispering Pines. The aftermath of the eclipse left Oakhaven shrouded in an unsettling quiet. The usual evening chatter, the sounds of laughter and shared meals, were replaced by hushed whispers and anxious glances. Evan, feeling the weight of the villagers' stares, retreated to her small cottage at the edge of the village, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Her cottage, a cozy, two-story structure built of weathered stone and timber, had always been her sanctuary. The scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards, the warmth of the hearth, these were the things that grounded her, that reminded her of the life she had built with Thomas. But tonight, even these familiar comforts couldn't dispel the unease that had settled deep within her bones. She lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the framed photographs of Thomas, his smiling face a bittersweet reminder of a love lost. She moved through the familiar motions of preparing a simple supper, a bowl of vegetable stew and a slice of crusty bread, but her appetite had vanished. The food sat untouched on the worn wooden table. Her thoughts kept returning to Reese, to his golden eyes, to his pronouncements about the moon and her supposed destiny. Moonbound. The word echoed in her mind, a label that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. She remembered her mother's stories, the tales she had dismissed as folklore, now taking on a terrifying new significance. The village of Oakhaven, nestled deep within a valley surrounded by towering pine forests, had always been isolated, a place where old traditions and beliefs held sway. It was a place where the veil between the real and the unreal seemed thinner. The villagers, though outwardly ordinary, were steeped in the lore of the surrounding wilderness, in the whispers of the wind through the pines, in the ancient secrets hidden within the mountains. They called it Whispering Pines, a name that reflected the constant murmur of the wind through the trees, a sound that often carried with it an eerie, almost sentient quality. The forest itself was a presence, a living entity that watched and waited. Evan had always felt a connection to it, a sense of peace and belonging when she walked among the towering trees. But now, after Reese's appearance, the forest felt different, charged with an energy that was both exhilarating and unsettling. She went to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon, now fully emerged from the shadow of the earth, hung high in the sky, a silver disk casting a pale, ethereal glow over the village. It seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light, a silent beacon calling out to her. She felt a pull, an undeniable urge to go outside, to walk into the forest, to seek out Reese and demand answers. But fear held her back. Fear of the unknown, fear of what she might become, fear of losing the last vestiges of her old life. She hugged herself, trying to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night. She felt lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, caught between the familiar comfort of her past and the terrifying allure of a future she didn't understand. A knock on the door startled her. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Who would be visiting her at this hour? After what had happened in the village square, she wouldn't be surprised if the villagers had decided to shun her. Or worse. She cautiously opened the door, peering out into the darkness. It was Elder Silas, his face etched with worry, his usually steady hands trembling slightly. He held a flickering lantern, its light casting long, dancing shadows on the porch. "Evan," he said, his voice low and strained. "May I come in?" She hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch echoing in the silence. He stood there for a moment, looking at her with a mixture of concern and pity. "I wanted to apologize," he began, his voice hesitant, "for the way the villagers reacted, for my own disbelief. It's a lot to take in." Evan nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I understand," she said softly. "It's a lot for me to take in, too." Silas sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I've been doing some research," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "In the old texts, the ones kept hidden in the church archives. The ones that speak of the moonbound." Evan's heart quickened. "And what did you find?" Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fascination. "The stories, they speak of a power, a connection to the moon, that is passed down through certain bloodlines. A power that awakens during a lunar eclipse. A power that transforms." "Transforms?" Evan repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Silas nodded. "Into something else. Something not entirely human. The stories call them lichens. Werewolves." He paused, letting the words sink in. The air in the cottage became thick with unspoken meaning. The ancient stories, the folklore, had suddenly, horrifyingly come to life, and she was right at its core. What lay ahead for her now, with the moon's power awakened within her, a future she had never imagined stretching before her, unwritten and full of shadows. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Forgotten Past. The word werewolves hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, filling the small cottage with a palpable sense of dread. Evan stared at Silas, her mind reeling. Werewolves. Creatures of myth and legend, of horror stories told to frighten children. It was impossible. And yet, the look on Silas's face, the tremor in his voice, told her that he believed it, every terrifying word. Werewolves, she repeated, the word feeling foreign and unbelievable on her tongue. But that's just stories. It can't be real. Silas shook his head slowly. The old texts, they speak of them as real. They describe their connection to the moon, their ability to shift between human and wolf form, their power. And their curse. Curse? Evan felt a chill run down her spine. The transformation, it's not always voluntary. It's tied to the phases of the moon, to strong emotions. It can be painful and dangerous. Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. The stories say that the moonbound, those who carry the Leakin bloodline, are often driven mad by the change, by the beast within. Evan felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The thought of losing control, of becoming something monstrous, filled her with terror. She had always been a creature of habit, of order, of control. The idea of surrendering to something wild, something untamed, was utterly terrifying. But my mother, she never said anything about this, Evan said, her voice trembling. She warned me about the eclipse, but she never mentioned werewolves. Silas sighed. Perhaps she didn't know. Or perhaps she was trying to protect you. The knowledge of the moonbound has been suppressed. Over the centuries, the Lycans have been hunted, persecuted. They have learned to hide, to blend in, to keep their true nature a secret. But Reese, he doesn't seem to be hiding, Evan pointed out. Reese is different, Silas said, his voice hesitant. He is an alpha, a leader. He has a level of control, of power, that most Lycans don't possess. And he has a purpose. A purpose? To what? To turn me into a werewolf? Evan felt a surge of anger, of defiance. Silas shook his head. I don't know his exact purpose, Evan. But the old texts speak of a prophecy about a moonbound woman who would restore the balance. Bring the Lycans back from the brink of extinction. Restore the balance? Evan repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. I'm supposed to save the werewolves? I'm just an old woman, Silas. I don't have any power. Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange intensity. You have more power than you realize, Evan. The moon's mark, it's a sign of your connection to the ancient bloodline, to the power that lies dormant within you. It's a power that needs to be awakened. Awakened? Evan felt a shiver of apprehension. How? Silas hesitated. The texts, they speak of a ritual, a ceremony that must be performed under the full moon, a ceremony that will initiate you, fully awaken the Leakin within. He avoided her direct gaze, a sign of his own disquiet. And if I refuse? Evan asked, her voice firm. Silas looked at her, his expression grave. The moon's pull, it's not something you can ignore, Evan. It will grow stronger with each passing day. It will consume you. If you don't embrace the change, it will destroy you. Evan felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She was trapped, caught between a destiny she didn't want and a fate she couldn't escape. She looked at Silas, her eyes pleading. Is there any other way? Silas shook his head slowly. I don't know, Evan. I wish I had better answers for you. But the old texts, they are all we have. And they are clear. The moonbound must embrace their destiny, or perish. He stood up, his movements stiff and weary. I should go, he said, his voice heavy with sadness. I'll leave you to your thoughts. He paused at the door, looking back at her. He said softly. Whatever you decide, know that you are not alone. The village, we may be afraid, but we are also loyal. We will stand by you. And with that, he was gone, leaving Evan alone in the flickering candlelight, the weight of his words, the weight of her impending destiny, pressing down on her. She looked at the untouched food on the table, at the photographs of Thomas, at the familiar objects that filled her cottage. Her life, her peaceful, predictable life, was slipping away, replaced by a terrifying unknown. The echoes of a forgotten past, of a bloodline she never knew she possessed, were calling to her, demanding that she embrace a future she didn't want. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. What was she going to do? The full moon was only a few weeks away, and with it, a decision that would change her life forever. The uncertainty gnawed at her. Chapter 5. The Scent of Pine and Wolf. The days following Silas's visit passed in a blur of anxiety and restless anticipation. Evan found herself drawn to the forest, walking the familiar paths she had trod countless times before, but now everything felt different. The whispering pines seemed to murmur secrets she couldn't quite decipher. The rustling leaves seemed to watch her with an unnerving awareness. The scent of the forest, once a comfort, now held a new, unsettling element, the faint, musky scent of wolf, a constant reminder of the transformation that awaited her. She tried to distract herself with her usual routines, tending to her herb garden, preparing meals she couldn't eat, cleaning her cottage with a frantic energy that belied her inner turmoil. But her mind kept returning to Rhys, to his golden eyes, to his pronouncements about her destiny. She found herself both repelled by and drawn to him, a confusing mixture of fear and a strange, undeniable curiosity. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the valley, she found herself standing at the edge of the forest, gazing into the deepening gloom. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and that other, wilder scent that sent a shiver of apprehension through her. She felt a pull, an undeniable urge to enter the woods, to seek out Rhys and demand answers. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that entering the forest, especially at night, was a risk. But the fear was slowly being overshadowed by a growing sense of inevitability. She couldn't run from this, from her destiny, any longer. She had to face it head-on. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the forest, the soft earth cushioning her footsteps. The trees towered above her, their branches intertwined, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the remaining sunlight. The air grew cooler, the scent of pine and wolf intensifying. She walked slowly, deliberately, her senses on high alert. She didn't have to walk far. She found him near a small clearing, bathed in the pale moonlight that filtered through the trees. He was leaning against a towering pine, his arms crossed, his golden eyes watching her approach. He seemed to blend seamlessly into the shadows, a creature of the forest, as much a part of it as the trees and the wind. He didn't speak, didn't move, simply waited for her to reach him. As she drew closer, she could see the details of his face more clearly, the sharp cheekbones, the strong jaw, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of a life lived, of secrets kept. He was undeniably handsome, in a wild, untamed way, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They radiated a power, an ancient knowledge, that both terrified and intrigued her. "You came," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Evan stopped a few feet away from him, maintaining a safe distance. "I need answers," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her heart. "Silas, he told me about the Moonbound. About werewolves." Rhys nodded slowly. "Silas is a wise man. He has kept the old knowledge alive, even when others have tried to forget." "But is it true?" Evan asked, her voice barely a whisper. Am I really one of them?" Rhys pushed himself away from the tree, his movements fluid and graceful. He took a step closer, his golden eyes searching hers. "You carry the bloodline, Evan, the blood of the lichens. It has been dormant within you, waiting for the right moment, for the eclipse, to awaken. But I don't feel any different, Evan protested. Rhys smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile that didn't reach his eyes. You will, he said softly. The change is gradual. It starts with heightened senses, with a connection to the moon, to the forest. With dreams. Dreams. Evan had been having strange dreams lately, dreams of running through the forest, of feeling the wind in her fur, of seeing the world through the eyes of a wolf. She hadn't understood them, had dismissed them as the product of her anxiety, but now the dreams they're real? She asked, her voice trembling. Rhys nodded. They are a glimpse of what you are becoming, of what you are destined to be. But I don't want to be a werewolf, Evan said, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. I don't want to lose control. I don't want to become a monster. Rhys's expression softened, just slightly. It's not about becoming a monster, Evan, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. It's about embracing your true nature, about accepting the power that lies within you, about becoming whole. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, but not quite touching. She flinched, instinctively, but didn't pull away. His fingers, long and elegant, brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, the touch sending an unexpected jolt of electricity through her. It was a gesture of tenderness? Or something else? I can help you, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I can guide you through the change. I can teach you to control the beast within, to harness the power of the moon. Evan looked at him, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, doubt, curiosity, and a flicker of something else. A spark of hope? Could she trust him? Could she trust this man, this creature of myth and legend, to guide her through this terrifying transformation? The scent of pine and wolf swirled around her, a tangible representation of the choice she had to make. Embrace her destiny, or be consumed by it. She looked into his golden eyes, searching for answers, for reassurance, and saw a reflection of her own uncertainty. The night held its breath, waiting for her decision. What path would she choose? Chapter 6. A dance under the shadowed moon. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and a tension that hummed in the cool night air. Evan's gaze remained locked on Rhys's, her mind struggling to reconcile the terrifying reality of her situation with the undeniable pull she felt towards him. He was offering her a lifeline, a way to navigate the treacherous waters of her transformation, but could she truly trust him? He seemed to sense her hesitation, his golden eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He didn't push, didn't pressure her, simply waited, allowing her the space to grapple with the enormity of the choice before her. Why? She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me? Rhys's expression remained unreadable, his face a mask of ancient secrets. The prophecy, he said, his voice low and resonant. You are the key, Evan, the one who can restore the balance. But I don't understand, Evan protested. I'm just an ordinary woman. I don't have any special powers. Rhys smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. You are far from ordinary, Evan. You carry the blood of kings, of ancient lichens who walked this earth long before humans built their villages and their cities. You have a power within you, a connection to the moon, that is stronger than you realize. He took a step closer, his presence filling her senses. The scent of pine and wolf intensified, a heady, intoxicating aroma that triggered a strange, primal response within her. She felt a pull, an undeniable attraction, that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The full moon is approaching, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The time of your initiation. The time when you will fully embrace your Lycan nature. Evan felt a surge of fear, but it was mixed with a strange sense of anticipation. She had spent her life avoiding risk, embracing routine, seeking comfort in the familiar. But now, faced with a destiny she couldn't escape, she felt a flicker of excitement. A desire to break free from the constraints of her old life, to embrace the wildness that was calling to her. What will happen? she asked, her voice trembling. During the initiation? Reese's golden eyes held hers, a silent promise of something both terrifying and wondrous. It will be a transformation, he said softly. A release. You will shed your human skin and embrace the beast within. You will run wild. You will howl at the moon. You will feel the power of your ancestors coursing through your veins. The image, both terrifying and alluring, filled her mind. She imagined herself running through the forest, transformed into a creature of power and grace, feeling the wind in her fur, the earth beneath her paws. It was a frightening thought, but also liberating. Will it hurt? She asked, her voice barely audible. Reese's expression softened. There will be pain, he admitted. But it will be fleeting. And it will be followed by ecstasy. The joy of embracing your true nature, of becoming whole. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. The touch was surprisingly gentle, sending a wave of warmth through her. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, instead leaning into his touch, seeking comfort in his presence. I will be with you, he said, his voice a low murmur. Every step of the way. I will guide you, protect you. You will not be alone. The words, spoken with such sincerity, resonated deeply within her. Alone. It was a fear that had haunted her for years, ever since Thomas's death. And now, this stranger, this Leakin, was offering her companionship, a connection, a sense of belonging. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against her ear. Tonight, he whispered, let me show you a glimpse of what awaits you. A taste of the freedom, of the power, that is your birthright. Before she could respond, before she could even fully process his words, he took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. He led her deeper into the clearing, to a spot where the moonlight streamed through the trees, illuminating the forest floor with a silvery glow. He turned to face her, his golden eyes shining in the darkness. Dance with me, Evanna, he said, his voice a low, seductive murmur. Dance with me under the shadowed moon. And then he began to move. He moved with a fluid grace that defied his size, his body swaying to an unheard rhythm, a primal dance that seemed to be woven into the very fabric of the forest. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her waist, and she found herself following his lead, her body moving instinctively, her feet finding their own rhythm on the soft earth. It wasn't a traditional dance, not the waltzes or foxtrots she had learned in her youth. It was something wilder, more primal, a dance of instinct, of connection, of surrender. She felt herself losing control, her inhibitions melting away, her body responding to the rhythm of the forest, to the pull of the moon, to the presence of the man who held her in his arms. The scent of pine and wolf enveloped her, a heady, intoxicating aroma that heightened her senses, making her feel alive. Alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to be swept away by the moment, by the magic of the night, by the promise of the transformation that awaited her. The fear was still there, lurking in the shadows, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of acceptance, of belonging, of destiny. She danced on, oblivious to everything but the rhythm, the moonlight, and the man who held her close. How long would this fleeting moment of peace last? Chapter 7. The Mark of the Silver Crescent. The dance under the moon was a blur of motion and sensation, a whirlwind of emotion that left Evan the breathless and disoriented. When Reese finally released her, she stumbled slightly, her legs unsteady, her heart pounding in her chest. The forest seemed to spin around her, the trees blurring into a swirling vortex of green and brown. Reese steadied her, his hand gripping her arm, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, her breath coming in ragged gasps. His face was close to hers, his golden eyes burning with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. What was that? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Reese smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. That, Evanna, he said softly, was a taste of your true nature. A glimpse of the power that lies within you. She felt different. Changed. The world seemed sharper, more vibrant, the sense of the forest more intense. She felt a heightened awareness of her surroundings, of the rustling leaves, of the distant hoot of an owl, of the subtle shift in the wind. I felt, she stammered, struggling to find the words to describe the sensation.
Free. Rhys nodded.
The Lycan spirit, it yearns for freedom, for the wild, for the connection to the moon. He released her arm, his hand lingering on her skin for a moment longer than necessary, sending another wave of warmth through her. He then gestured towards her left wrist. Look, he said, his voice low and resonant. Evan looked down at her wrist, her eyes widening in disbelief. There, on the inside of her wrist, where her skin was softest and palest, was a mark. A faint, silvery mark in the shape of a crescent moon. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was undeniably there. What is that? She asked, her voice filled with awe and a touch of fear. The mark of the silver crescent, Rhys said, his voice reverent. It is the sign of the moonbound, the mark of your Lycan heritage. It appears when the transformation begins. Evan touched the mark gingerly, her fingers tracing the delicate curve of the crescent. It felt warm, almost alive. It was a physical manifestation of the change that was happening within her, a visible reminder of her connection to the moon, to the Lycans, to Rhys. It wasn't there before, she said, her voice trembling. Rhys nodded. It appears gradually, as the moon's influence grows stronger. It will become more prominent as you approach the full moon, as you near the time of your initiation. The full moon. The thought sent a shiver of apprehension through her. She was still afraid, still uncertain, but the fear was slowly being replaced by a growing sense of acceptance and anticipation. The dance, the mark, they were undeniable proof of her transformation, of the destiny that awaited her.
What happens now?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rhys's golden eyes held hers, a silent promise of something both terrifying and wondrous. Now, he said softly, we prepare. We prepare for the full moon, for the ceremony, for the awakening. Prepare how? Evan asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Rhys took a step closer, his presence filling her senses. The scent of pine and wolf intensified, a heady, intoxicating aroma that triggered a strange, primal response within her. There are things you need to learn, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. About your Lycan nature, about your abilities, about the dangers that await you. Dangers? Evan felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Rhys nodded. The Lycans, we are not alone. There are those who hunt us, who seek to destroy us. You must learn to protect yourself, to defend yourself, to survive. The words sent a chill down her spine. She had lived a sheltered life, a life of peace and tranquility. The thought of facing danger, of fighting for her survival, was utterly terrifying. I don't know if I can, she said, her voice trembling. Rhys reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. The touch was surprisingly gentle, sending a wave of warmth through her. You can, Evan, he said, his voice firm, yet soothing. You are stronger than you realize. And you will not be alone. I will be with you, every step of the way. His words, spoken with such conviction, gave her a flicker of hope, a spark of courage. She looked into his golden eyes, searching for reassurance, and found a strength that mirrored her own growing resolve. Teach me, she said, her voice gaining strength. Teach me everything I need to know. Rhys smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face, making him appear even more handsome, more human. Then let us begin, he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. The moon is waiting, and so is your destiny. He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle, and led her deeper into the forest, towards the unknown, towards a future she was finally ready to embrace. The mark of the silver crescent pulsed faintly on her wrist, a constant reminder of the transformation that was underway, of the wildness that was awakening within her. A new sense of purpose, a fragile hope, blossomed in her chest, despite the dangers that surely lay ahead. What would these lessons entail? Chapter 8. Forbidden knowledge in the ancient library. Reese led Evan the not deeper into the wild, untamed heart of the forest as she expected, but back towards the village, to a place she had never thought to associate with anything supernatural, the ancient library. It was a building she had visited countless times in her life, a repository of local history, gardening manuals, and well-worn novels, a place of quiet contemplation, not secrets and leak-in lore. The library, a squat, stone structure with arched windows and a heavy, oak door, stood on a small rise overlooking the village square. It was usually closed at this late hour, but Reese produced a large, iron key from his pocket, its intricate design hinting at an age far exceeding the building itself. The key turned in the lock with a low, grating sound, a sound that echoed in the stillness of the night. Inside, the air was cool and dry, carrying the familiar scent of old paper, leather-bound books, and beeswax. Moonlight streamed through the arched windows, illuminating rows upon rows of bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft creak of the floorboards as they walked. "I never thought," Evan began, her voice hushed, "that this place held secrets." Reese smiled, a faint, knowing smile. "Every place holds secrets, he said softly. "It's just a matter of knowing where to look." He led her to a section of the library she had never explored before, a dimly lit alcove hidden behind a towering bookcase. The shelves here were filled with ancient tomes, their leather covers cracked and faded, their pages brittle with age. The titles were written in a language she didn't recognize, a script that looked both familiar and utterly foreign. Reese pulled a thick, heavy volume from the shelf, its cover adorned with a silver crescent moon, identical to the mark on Avant's wrist. He placed it on a large, wooden table, its surface scarred with age and use. "This," he said, his voice reverent, "is the Liber Luni, the Book of the Moon. It contains the history of the lichens, their origins, their abilities, their curse." Evan approached the table, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at the book with a mixture of awe and trepidation. It felt powerful, as if it held the weight of centuries of Leakin history within its pages. Reese opened the book, his fingers carefully turning the brittle pages. The script was indeed foreign, but as he began to read aloud, translating the words into English, Evan found that she could understand. It was as if the knowledge was already within her, dormant, waiting to be awakened. He spoke of the origins of the lichens, of their ancient connection to the moon goddess, of their ability to shift between human and wolf form, of their power and their vulnerability. He spoke of the different Leakin bloodlines, of their unique abilities and characteristics. He spoke of the Alpha, the leader of the pack, and of the prophecy. "The prophecy," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "speaks of a moon-bound woman, a woman born under a lunar eclipse, who will possess the power to unite the Leakin clans, to restore the balance, to bring us back from the brink of extinction." Evan felt a chill run down her spine. The prophecy, it was about her. She was the one they had been waiting for, the one who was destined to save them. "But why me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm just an ordinary woman. I don't have any special powers." Reese looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a strange intensity. "You are not ordinary, Evan, he said softly. "You are chosen. The moon has marked you, has awakened the Leakin blood within you. You have a power, a connection to the moon, that is stronger than you realize." He continued to read, translating the ancient text, revealing more about the Leakin world, about their rituals, their traditions, their enemies. "The Hunters," he said, his voice hardening. "They are a secret society dedicated to the eradication of the lichens. They have been hunting us for centuries, using silver and wolfsbane to weaken and destroy us." Evan felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Hunters. Another element of danger, another threat to her newfound existence. How do we fight them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Reese closed the book, his expression grave. "We fight them with our strength, with our cunning, with our unity. But most importantly," he added, his voice firm, "we fight them with the power of the moon." He looked at her, his golden eyes searching hers. The full moon is approaching, Evan, he said softly. The time of your initiation. The time when you will fully embrace your Leakin nature. And the time when you will learn to fight. The words sent a shiver of both fear and anticipation through her. The initiation. The transformation. The fight. It was a daunting prospect, but she was no longer the same woman she had been a few weeks ago. The moon had changed her. Rhys had changed her. The knowledge she had gained in this ancient library had changed her. She was Evan the Corbin, widow, gardener, resident of Whispering Pines. But she was also something more. She was moonbound. She was Leakin. And she was ready. She looked at Rhys, a newfound determination hardening her gaze. What dangers did the prophecy further detail? Chapter 9. Dreams of Running Wild. The nights that followed were filled with dreams, vivid and intense, unlike anything Evan had ever experienced. They were not the fragmented, nonsensical dreams of her ordinary life, but visceral, sensory experiences that transported her to another world, another reality. In these dreams, she was a wolf, a magnificent creature of silver-gray fur with powerful muscles and sharp senses. She ran through the forest, the wind whipping through her fur, the earth flying beneath her paws. She smelled the rich, earthy scent of the forest floor, the sharp tang of pine needles, the subtle traces of other creatures, deer, rabbits, foxes. She heard the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of another wolf. The dreams were not always peaceful. Sometimes she was hunting, chasing prey through the undergrowth, her instincts driving her, her hunger a powerful, primal force. Sometimes she was being hunted, pursued by shadowy figures with silver weapons, their faces hidden, their intent clear. These dreams were terrifying, but also exhilarating. She felt a sense of freedom, of power, of connection to the wild that she had never experienced before. She felt alive. She would wake up in the mornings, her heart pounding, her body covered in a thin sheen of sweat, the lingering scent of pine and wolf clinging to her skin. The dreams felt real. More real than her waking life, more real than the quiet routine of her days. She confided in Rhys, sharing the details of her dreams, the fear and the exhilaration, the sense of transformation. He listened patiently, his golden eyes filled with a knowing understanding. The dreams are a part of the change, he explained. They are a way for your Leakin spirit to express itself, to prepare you for the full moon, for the initiation. But the hunters, Evan said, her voice trembling. They were in my dreams. They were chasing me. Rhys nodded, his expression grave. The hunters are a real threat, Evan. They are always watching, always waiting for an opportunity to strike. How do I fight them? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to shift. How to control the wolf within. Rhys smiled, a faint, encouraging smile. That is what we will work on, he said softly. Before the full moon, I will teach you the basics of shifting, of controlling your Leakin form, of harnessing the power of the moon. He began her training, not in the library, but in the forest, under the watchful eye of the moon. He taught her to listen to her instincts, to trust her senses, to connect with the wildness within. He taught her to move like a wolf, to run, to jump, to stalk, to hunt. The training was difficult, both physically and mentally. Evan, despite her age, was surprisingly agile, her body adapting to the new movements, the new demands. But the mental aspect was more challenging. She had to learn to let go of her human inhibitions, to embrace her primal instincts, to surrender to the wolf within. There were moments of frustration, of doubt, of fear. But Rhys was always there, patient, encouraging, pushing her to her limits, but never beyond. He was a demanding teacher, but also a supportive companion. She found herself growing increasingly reliant on him, trusting him, drawn to his strength, his wisdom, his presence. One evening, as they were training near a secluded waterfall, Evan stumbled, losing her balance and falling to the ground. She cried out in pain, her ankle twisting beneath her. Rhys was instantly at her side, his hands gently examining her ankle. His touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, a warmth that eased the pain. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Evan nodded, her face flushed. "I think so," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just twisted it." He helped her to sit up, his arms supporting her back. He was close to her, so close she could feel the warmth of his body, smell the scent of pine and wolf that clung to him. "You are pushing yourself too hard," he said softly, his golden eyes searching hers. Evan looked away, embarrassed. "I want to be ready," she said, her voice low. "For the full moon. For the hunters." Rhys sighed. "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "But you need to be patient. The transformation, it takes time. You cannot force it." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. The touch was surprisingly tender, sending another wave of warmth through her. "Rest," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Let your body heal. We will continue tomorrow." He helped her to stand, supporting her weight as she limped back towards the village. The moon was high in the sky, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the forest. Evan leaned against Rhys, her body aching, her mind racing. She was grateful for his support, for his guidance, for his presence. She was still afraid, still uncertain about the future, but she was no longer alone. She had Rhys, and she had the moon, and she had the growing power of the wolf within. She felt a flicker of hope, a spark of courage, amidst the fear and the uncertainty. She would be ready. She had to be. What would tomorrow's training reveal? Chapter 10. The Hunter's Snare. The next day dawned gray and overcast, the sky mirroring the unease that had settled in Avant's heart after her injury. Her ankle was still sore, a throbbing reminder of her vulnerability, but she was determined to continue her training. Rhys had stressed the importance of being prepared, of mastering the basics of her Lycan form before the full moon, and she wouldn't let a minor injury slow her down. However, Rhys was nowhere to be found. He hadn't come to her cottage that morning, as he usually did, and a sense of disquiet, beyond the usual apprehension, began to creep into her. She waited, tending to her garden, the familiar scent of herbs offering a small measure of comfort, but the hours ticked by, and still, he didn't appear. By late afternoon, worry had blossomed into full-blown anxiety. She decided to go to the library, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for his absence. The village was unusually quiet, the villagers going about their business with a subdued air, their eyes avoiding hers. She felt a growing sense of isolation, of being an outsider. The library was empty, the air heavy with the scent of old books and dust. She went to the alcove where they had studied the Liber Luni, hoping to find some sign of Rhys, some message, but there was nothing. The book lay open on the table, the same page they had been reading the previous night, but Rhys was gone. As she was about to leave, a glint of silver caught her eye. It was a small, silver dagger, lying on the floor near the bookcase, partially hidden in the shadows. She picked it up, her heart pounding in her chest. The dagger was intricately crafted, its hilt adorned with a wolf's head, its blade etched with strange symbols. It was beautiful and terrifying. She recognized the symbols. They were the same ones that had appeared in her dreams, the symbols of the hunters. This was a hunter's weapon. But what was it doing here in the library? A sudden noise startled her, a soft creak from the back of the library. She turned, her hand instinctively tightening around the dagger, her senses on high alert. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man she didn't recognize. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and cold, gray eyes. He wore dark clothing and a silver chain with a wolf's head hung around his neck. He smiled, a cruel, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "What do we have here?" The moonbound woman, Rhys's little pet. Evan felt a surge of fear, but she stood her ground, her grip firm on the dagger. Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I am Hunter," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "And you, my dear, are my prey." He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on her, his movements slow and deliberate. Evan knew she was in danger, that she was no match for this man, this hunter, in her human form. But she wouldn't go down without a fight. "Where is Reese?" she demanded, her voice gaining strength. The hunter chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Reese? Oh, he's indisposed. We have him. And soon we will have you." Evan felt a wave of despair wash over her. Reese captured. The thought filled her with a rage she had never known before, a primal fury that burned in her veins. "You won't touch him," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I won't let you." The hunter laughed. "You? What can you do? You're just an old woman. You haven't even shifted yet. You're powerless." He lunged at her, his hand reaching for her, his fingers like claws. Evan reacted instinctively, driven by a surge of adrenaline, by the burgeoning power of the wolf within. She sidestepped his attack, the silver dagger flashing in the dim light. She slashed at him, her movements clumsy but surprisingly effective. The dagger grazed his arm, drawing a thin line of blood. The hunter hissed in pain, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't expected her to fight back, to be so fierce. "You'll pay for that," he snarled, his voice filled with rage. He attacked again, faster this time, more aggressively. Evan fought back, using the dagger as best she could, but she was outmatched. He was stronger, faster, more experienced. He disarmed her, the dagger clattering to the floor, and grabbed her wrist, his grip like a vice. "Now," he said, his voice triumphant, "you're mine." He dragged her towards the back of the library, towards a hidden door she hadn't noticed before. Evan struggled, kicking and screaming, but he was too strong. She was trapped, and Reese was captured, and the full moon was fast approaching. She was out of time, and seemingly out of options. Where would the hunter take her? Chapter 11. Revelations in the moonlit glade. The hidden door led to a narrow, winding staircase that descended deep into the earth. The air grew cold and damp, carrying the musty scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, like the tang of blood. Evan struggled against the hunter's grip, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had to escape, had to find a way to warn the villagers, to save Reese. The hunter dragged her down the stairs, his grip unrelenting, his breath hot on her neck. He chuckled, a low, cruel sound that echoed in the narrow passage. "Don't bother struggling, old woman," he said, his voice mocking. "There's no escape. This is our sanctuary, our stronghold. You're in hunter territory now." The staircase opened into a large, underground chamber, lit by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn stone walls. The chamber was filled with weapon swords, axes, bows, and arrows, all made of silver. There were cages, iron bars cold and forbidding, and in one of them Reese. Ivan's heart lurched at the sight of him. He was chained to the wall, his body bruised and battered, his golden eyes dimmed with pain. But he was alive. The hunter pushed her forward, towards the cage. Reese looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse and weak. "Evan," he rasped. The hunter laughed. "Touching reunion," he sneered. "But it won't last long." He turned to face Evan, his gray eyes filled with a cold, predatory gleam. "You see, old woman," he said, his voice smooth and menacing, "we've been watching you. We've been waiting for you to blossom, to embrace your leaken nature. And now you're ripe for the picking. What do you want?" Evan asked, her voice trembling. "We want to end the leaken threat," the hunter said, his voice filled with a fanatic zeal. "To cleanse the world of your kind. And you, moonbound woman, are the key." "The key?" Evan repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "The prophecy," the hunter said, his voice dripping with contempt. "It speaks of your power, of your ability to unite the Leaken clans, to restore the balance. We can't allow that to happen." He gestured towards Reese. "He was supposed to be your guide, your protector. But he failed. And now you both will pay the price." He turned to address another figure who had been standing silently in the shadows, a woman with long, black hair and piercing blue eyes. She wore the same dark clothing as the hunter, the same silver wolf's head pendant. "Prepare the ritual," he said, his voice commanding. "The full moon is almost upon us. It's time to extract her power." The woman nodded, her expression cold and impassive. She moved towards a large, stone altar that stood in the center of the chamber, its surface stained with what looked like dried blood. Evan felt a wave of terror wash over her. The ritual. Extract her power. What did they mean? What were they going to do to her? The hunter turned back to face her, a cruel smile on his lips. "Don't worry, old woman," he said, his voice mocking. "It won't hurt much. At least, not at first." He grabbed her arm, dragging her towards the altar. Evan struggled, but his grip was too strong. She looked at Reese, her eyes pleading, but he was helpless, chained to the wall, his strength depleted. As the hunter forced her towards the altar, a sudden surge of power coursed through her veins. It was unexpected, intense, primal. She felt a shift, a change within her, a tearing sensation, as if her very bones were rearranging themselves. She cried out, a sound that was both human and wolf. Her hands transformed, her fingers lengthening into claws, her nails sharpening into points. Fur sprouted on her arms, her legs, her face. Her teeth elongated, becoming fangs. The hunter stared at her, his eyes widening in disbelief, in fear. He had expected resistance, but not this. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated the power of the moon. Evan, the partially transformed, a creature of both human and wolf, lunged at him, her claws raking across his face, drawing blood. He screamed in pain, stumbling backward, his grip on her arm loosening. She broke free, her body surging with adrenaline, with the power of the wolf within. She turned to face the woman at the altar, her eyes glowing with a fierce, golden light. The woman froze, her eyes wide with terror, the silver ritual knife falling from her hand. Evan roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the chamber, a sound that echoed the ancient power of the lichens, of the moon, of her own burgeoning strength. She was no longer just Evan the Corbin, widow, gardener. She was moonbound. She was Leakin, and she was free. The transformation, incomplete but powerful, had given her a chance. But what could she do now, trapped underground, surrounded by enemies, with Reese still chained and helpless? The moon's light, unable to reach this subterranean prison, offered no guidance, only the cold stone and the burning hatred of the hunters. Chapter 12. The Price of Protection. The underground chamber, once filled with the hunters' smug pronouncements, now echoed with the raw, untamed power of Avant's roar. The partially transformed Leakin stood between the hunters and Reese, a figure of primal fury, her eyes burning with a golden light that mirrored the intensity of the moon, even in this subterranean darkness. The hunter who had captured her, his face bleeding from the deep gashes she had inflicted, stumbled back, his hand pressed against his wounds. His eyes, previously filled with cold confidence, now flickered with fear and uncertainty. The other hunter, the woman who had been preparing the ritual, remained frozen, her face pale, the silver knife lying forgotten at her feet. Evan took a step towards them, her claws extended, her fangs bared. She was still learning to control her shifting form, the transformation incomplete, but the surge of power was undeniable. It was a raw, intoxicating force, fueled by adrenaline, by rage, by the desperate need to protect Reese. You're not supposed to," the male hunter stammered, his voice trembling. "You're not supposed to shift, not yet." Evan didn't respond, couldn't respond. The wolf within was too strong, too dominant, suppressing her human voice, her human thoughts. She was driven by instinct, by the primal urge to protect her mate. The word, mate, flashed through her mind, unexpected and unsettling. It wasn't a word she had ever used to describe Thomas, her beloved husband. But it felt right. Reese was her mate. The moon had bound them together, their destinies intertwined. And she would protect him, no matter the cost. The female hunter finally found her voice, her tone sharp and commanding. "Kill her," she shrieked.
Kill the beast.
The male hunter, regaining some of his composure, drew a silver sword from its scabbard, its blade gleaming in the torchlight. He advanced towards Evan, his movements cautious, his eyes wary. Evan lunged, her claws slashing at him, forcing him to retreat. She was faster, stronger than she had been in her human form, but she was also inexperienced. She didn't know how to fight, how to fully utilize her Lycan abilities. The hunter pressed his attack, his sword whistling through the air, forcing her to defend herself. She parried his blows with her claws, the silver scraping against her fur, causing a searing pain that she barely registered. She was losing ground, being forced back towards the wall away from Reese. She needed to shift, fully transform,
but she didn't know how.
Reese had been teaching her, but the lessons were incomplete. The full moon was the key, he had said, but the full moon was still hours away. She glanced at Reese, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and pride. He was watching her, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to communicate with her, to guide her, without words. Suddenly she understood. He wasn't just watching her. He was sharing his strength. He was a powerful alpha. Even weakened and chained, he possessed a connection to the moon, a power that he could lend to her. She closed her eyes, focusing on Reese, on his presence, on his strength. She felt a surge of energy flow into her, a warmth that spread through her body, easing the pain, fueling the transformation. She opened her eyes, her vision sharper, clearer. She felt her body changing, shifting, completing the transformation. She grew taller, stronger, her fur thickening, her claws lengthening, her fangs becoming more prominent. She was no longer partially transformed. She was a wolf, a full-fledged Lycan, powerful and majestic. She roared, a sound that shook the chamber, a sound that drowned out the hunter's shouts, a sound that echoed the ancient power of her bloodline. The male hunter faltered, his eyes wide with terror. He had never faced a fully transformed Lycan before, especially not one with the power of the moonbound. Evan attacked, her movements swift and graceful, her claws and fangs tearing at him, forcing him to retreat. She was a creature of the wild, of the moon, of pure, untamed power. The female hunter, realizing that they were outmatched, tried to flee, to escape through the hidden door. But Evan was too fast. She intercepted her, blocking her path, her golden eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. The woman cowered, her face pale with terror. She knew she was no match for this beast. Evan didn't kill her. She couldn't. The wolf within was strong, but Evan's human conscience, her sense of morality, still held sway. She knocked the woman unconscious with a powerful blow, leaving her slumped against the wall. She turned her attention back to the male hunter, who was now desperately trying to defend himself against her relentless attacks. He was wounded, exhausted, his silver sword slipping from his grasp. Evan pinned him to the ground, her claws pressing against his throat, her fangs inches from his face. She could kill him, end his life with a single bite. But she hesitated. She looked at Reese, his eyes watching her, his expression unreadable. Was he urging her to kill? Or to show mercy? She made her decision. She released the hunter, stepping back, allowing him to scramble to his feet. "Go," she growled, her voice a low, guttural rumble. "And tell your kind. Tell them that the moonbound has awakened. Tell them that the Lycans will no longer be hunted. Tell them that the balance is about to be restored." The hunter, his face bruised and bleeding, didn't hesitate. He fled, disappearing through the hidden door, leaving Evan alone with Reese, the unconscious female hunter, and the echoes of her roar. She had protected him, but at what cost to herself, to her humanity? The shift had been exhilarating, terrifying, and ultimately necessary. But the battle was far from over. Chapter 13. Scars of the past, bonds of the future. The adrenaline that had fueled Evan's transformation began to fade, leaving her feeling weak and disoriented. The shift back to her human form was gradual, less violent than the initial change, but still unsettling. Her bones rearranged themselves, her fur receded, her claws retracted, her fangs shrinking back to normal teeth. She was left standing naked in the underground chamber, her body trembling, her skin covered in a thin sheen of sweat. Rhys, still chained to the wall, watched her with a mixture of concern and admiration. His golden eyes, though dimmed with pain, held a warmth that reached deep within her, easing the lingering fear, the lingering wildness. "Evan, he rasped, his voice hoarse, but filled with relief. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her voice still unsteady. I think so," she said, her gaze meeting his.
You helped me.
"You shared your strength." He smiled, a faint, weary smile. "The bond," he said softly. "The moonbound bond. It allows us to connect. To share our strength, our emotions. The bond." Evan had felt it during the fight, a powerful connection to Rhys, a sense of unity. It was more than just a physical connection. It was emotional, spiritual. It was the bond of mates. She stumbled towards him, her legs still weak, her body aching. She reached for the chains that bound him, her fingers fumbling with the cold, iron links. "I can't break them," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "They're too strong." Rhys looked at the chains, his expression grim. "They're made of silver," he said softly. "Infused with wolfsbane. Designed to weaken lichens." Evan felt a surge of despair. Silver. Wolfsbane. The hunter's weapons. She couldn't free him. She was helpless. She looked around the chamber, searching for something, anything, that could help. Her gaze fell upon the silver sword that the hunter had dropped, its blade gleaming in the torchlight. Silver. It was dangerous to lichens, but it was also strong. She picked up the sword, her hand trembling. The silver burned her skin, causing a searing pain, but she ignored it. She had to free Rhys. She approached the chains, the sword held high. She closed her eyes, focusing on Rhys, on the bond that connected them, on the strength that he had shared with her. She brought the sword down on the chains, striking them with all her might. The silver clashed against iron, sparks flying, the sound echoing in the chamber. She struck again, and again, and again, the pain in her hand intensifying, but her determination unwavering. Finally, with a loud crack, one of the links broke. Then another and another. The chains fell away, freeing Rhys from the wall. He collapsed to the ground, his body weak and battered. Evan knelt beside him, her hands gently cradling his face. "Rhys," she whispered, her voice filled with concern. Are you going to be okay?" He nodded, his golden eyes meeting hers. "I'll be all right," he said, his voice weak but gaining strength. "Thanks to you." He reached out, his hand touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the faint lines of her transformation, the scars of the past, the bonds of the future. The touch sent a wave of warmth through her, a reassurance that she was not alone, that they were in this together. They remained there for a moment, huddled together in the flickering torchlight, their bodies aching, their spirits bruised, but their bond unbroken. The hunters had tried to destroy them, to separate them, but they had failed. The moon had brought them together, and the moon would protect them. But the escape from the underground chamber was only the beginning. The hunters were still out there, and the full moon, the time of Avant's complete and irreversible transformation, was fast approaching. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. They needed to find a way to return to the village, warn the others, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. Evana looked at the unconscious female hunter. Would they take her with them, or leave her to whatever fate awaited her in this subterranean prison? A difficult decision, one fraught with moral implications, loomed before them. Chapter 14. A Trial by Fire and Spirit. The decision of what to do with the unconscious female hunter weighed heavily on Evana. Leaving her seemed cruel, a betrayal of her own human values, yet taking her with them presented a significant risk. She could alert other hunters, jeopardize their escape, and endanger the villagers. Rhys, still weak but recovering his strength, watched Avant's internal struggle, his golden eyes filled with understanding. He knew the burden she carried, the responsibility of the moonbound, the conflict between her human compassion and her burgeoning Lycan instincts. "She's a danger," he said softly, his voice still hoarse. "If she escapes, she'll alert the others." Evan nodded, her brow furrowed with worry. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I can't just leave her here. It's wrong." Rhys sighed. "There is another way," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "A way to neutralize her. To prevent her from harming us or anyone else." "What way?" Evan asked, her heart pounding in her chest. He hesitated, his expression grave. "The Lycan bond," he said softly. "We can bind her."
"To you."
"Make her subservient. Prevent her from acting against us." Evan felt a chill run down her spine. Bind her? To her? It sounded wrong. Like a violation of her free will. "Is that ethical?" she asked, her voice trembling. Rhys looked away, his expression troubled. "Ethics are a luxury we cannot always afford, Evan, he said softly. "Especially in times of war. This is about survival. Our survival. The survival of the village." Evan knew he was right. The hunters were a ruthless enemy, dedicated to the eradication of the Lycans. They wouldn't hesitate to kill her, to kill Rhys, to kill anyone who stood in their way. She looked at the unconscious woman, her face pale and vulnerable. She hated the idea of controlling her, of taking away her freedom, but she also knew that she couldn't risk letting her go. How do we do it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rhys explained the process, a ritual that involved sharing a small amount of her blood with the hunter, a ritual that would create a psychic link between them, a bond that would make the hunter obedient. It was a risky procedure, especially with Evan still new to her Lycan abilities, but she knew she had to do it. It was the only way to ensure their safety, the only way to protect the village. With Rhys guiding her, she performed the ritual, her hand trembling as she made a small cut on her arm, allowing a few drops of her blood to fall onto the hunter's lips. She felt a connection, a strange, unsettling feeling of unity. The hunter stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Evan, her expression confused, then submissive. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a blank obedience. "You will follow me," Evan said, her voice firm, testing the bond. "You will not harm us. You will not alert the other hunters." The hunter nodded, her eyes fixed on Avant's. "Yes, mistress," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Evan felt a surge of unease. The bond had worked, but at what cost? She had taken control of another person's will, a violation of her own moral code. But she had done it to protect Rhys, to protect the village, to protect herself. With the hunter now under her control, they began their escape from the underground chamber. Rhys, still weak, leaned on Evan for support, the female hunter following silently behind them. They navigated the narrow, winding staircase, the air growing warmer and fresher as they ascended. They reached the hidden door, the entrance to the library, and Evan hesitated. "The villagers," she said, her voice filled with concern. "They need to be warned." "About the hunters?" Rhys nodded. "I know," he said softly. "But we need to be careful. We don't know how many hunters are in the village." They decided to wait until nightfall, to use the cover of darkness to make their way to Silas's house. The elder was the only one they could trust, the only one who knew the truth about the moonbound, about the Lycans, about the prophecy. As they waited in the shadows of the library, the full moon began to rise, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the village. Evan felt a pull, a powerful surge of energy that coursed through her veins. The transformation was beginning, the final, irreversible shift into her Lycan form. She looked at Rhys, and she knew this trial, this journey, would lead to more conflict. Would the village accept her? Chapter 15. The Unveiling of Lycanthropy. The full moon climbed higher in the sky, bathing the village of whispering pines in its silvery light. Evan felt the change accelerating within her, the pull of the moon becoming irresistible. Her bones shifted, her muscles rippled, her skin tingled with the sprouting of fur. She could no longer contain the transformation, the Leakin spirit demanding its release. Rhys watched her, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of awe and concern. He knew the power of the full moon, the intensity of the first complete shift. He also knew the danger they faced, exposed in the village, with the hunters possibly lurking nearby. "Evan," he said softly, his voice urgent. "You need to control it. Focus. Hold on to your human self." But it was too late. The transformation overwhelmed her, sweeping away her human consciousness, replacing it with the primal instincts of the wolf. She roared, a sound that echoed through the silent village, a sound of both pain and liberation. She was no longer Evan the Corbin, the widow, the gardener. She was a wolf, a magnificent creature of silver-gray fur, with powerful muscles and sharp senses. She was Leakin, moonbound, and free. The bound hunter cowered, her eyes wide with terror, instinctively recognizing the dominance of the fully transformed alpha. Rhys, though still weak, stood his ground, his own Leakin nature resonating with Avance, a silent communication passing between them. Evan, in her wolf form, paced restlessly, her senses on high alert. She smelled the familiar scents of the village, but also the acrid scent of the hunters, faint but present. They were here, in Whispering Pines, waiting for them. She nudged Rhys with her snout, a silent urging to move, to escape. He understood, his own Leakin instincts heightened by her transformation. "Silas," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get to Silas." They moved through the shadows, Evan leading the way, her wolf senses guiding them, the bound hunter trailing silently behind. They avoided the main streets, sticking to the back alleys, the gardens, the edges of the forest. They reached Silas's house, a small cottage near the church. Evan, in her wolf form, scratched at the door, a low, insistent sound. Silas opened the door, his eyes widening in disbelief, in fear. He stared at Evan, at the magnificent wolf standing before him, at Rhys, bruised and battered but alive, at the bound hunter, her expression blank and obedient. "Evan," he whispered, his voice trembling. Is that really you?" Rhys stepped forward, his voice calm and reassuring. "It's her, Silas," he said softly. "She's transformed. She's moonbound." Silas, though initially shocked, quickly regained his composure. He was a man of faith, a man of knowledge, a man who understood the ancient lore of Whispering Pines. He had seen the signs, had read the prophecies, had prepared himself for this moment. He stepped aside, allowing them to enter. "Come in," he said, his voice firm. "You're safe here." Inside the cottage, the air was warm and comforting, the scent of burning wood and herbs filling the room. Silas led them to a small sitting room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. Evan, still in her wolf form, paced restlessly, her senses on high alert. She could feel the presence of the hunters, their proximity, their intent. "They're here, Silas," Rhys said, his voice low and urgent. "The hunters. They're in the village." Silas nodded, his expression grave. "I know," he said softly. "I've seen them. They're looking for you." "For Evan, we need to warn the villagers," Rhys said. "We need to prepare them for a fight." Silas hesitated. "The villagers," he said, his voice troubled. "They're afraid. They don't understand. They may not accept Evan, in her wolf form." Rhys knew he was right. The villagers, though steeped in the lore of Whispering Pines, were also human. They feared what they didn't understand. They feared the lichens, the creatures of the night, the beasts of the forest. Evan, sensing their hesitation, their doubt, let out a low growl, a sound of frustration, of pain. She was one of them, Evan Corbin, a member of their community, a friend and neighbor. But she was also different. She was Leakin. She was moonbound. And she was alone. Rhys looked at Evan, his golden eyes filled with understanding, with compassion. He knew what she was feeling, the isolation, the fear of rejection. He turned to Silas, his voice firm. "We have no choice, Silas," he said. "We must face them. Together." We must show them that Evan is not a monster, that she is their protector. He looked at Evan, his gaze meeting hers, a silent communication passing between them. He was asking her to trust him, to trust the villagers, to trust herself. Evan, in her wolf form, nodded, her golden eyes shining with a fierce determination. She would face them. She would show them who she truly was. She would fight for her place, for her pack, for her home. The unveiling of her lycanthropy to the village was a gamble, a risk, but it was one she was willing to take. The full moon hung high in the sky, a silent witness to her decision. What would the villagers' reaction be? Chapter 16. Heartbreak and the Howling Wind. Rhys, Silas, and Evan still in her magnificent wolf form stepped out of the cottage and into the moonlit village square. The bound hunter remained inside, under Silas's watchful eye. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the gentle whisper of the wind through the pines, a sound that now carried a mournful, almost ominous quality. The villagers, alerted by Avant's earlier roar, had gathered in the square, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and hostility. They held torches, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding buildings, illuminating the scene with an eerie, unsettling glow. Evan felt a pang of heartbreak as she saw their expressions. These were her neighbors, her friends, the people she had known her entire life. But now, they looked at her with fear, with disgust. They saw her as a monster, a beast, a threat. Old Mrs. Henderson, who had always been so kind, so welcoming, clutched her rosary beads, her lips moving in silent prayer. Young Thomas, the blacksmith's son, stood rigid, his hand gripping a hunting knife, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Elder Silas stepped forward, his voice calm and reassuring, trying to bridge the gap between Evan and her community. "My friends," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness of the night. "I know you're afraid. I know you don't understand. But she's still Evan. She's one of us." He gestured towards Evan, her silver gray fur gleaming in the moonlight, her golden eyes shining with a fierce intelligence. "She's transformed," Silas continued. "She's moonbound. She's a Leakin. But she's not a monster. She's our protector." The villagers remained silent, their eyes fixed on Evan, their expressions unreadable. They were torn between their fear of the unknown and their loyalty to one of their own. Suddenly, a voice cried out from the crowd, a voice filled with anger and hatred. "She's a beast." It was Thomas, the blacksmith's son, his face contorted with rage. "She's dangerous. She should be destroyed." His words were like a spark, igniting the fear and prejudice that had been simmering beneath the surface. Other voices joined in, a chorus of condemnation, of rejection. "Monster. Get out. She's not one of us." Evan felt a sharp pain in her chest, a pain deeper than any physical wound. The rejection of her community, of her friends, of her neighbors, was devastating. She had hoped for understanding, for acceptance, but she had found only fear and hatred. Rhys stepped forward, his voice firm and commanding. "She is not a monster," he roared, his own Leakin nature rising to the surface, his eyes flashing with a golden light. "She is your protector. She has saved my life. She has fought the hunters. She is your only hope." His words seemed to have little effect. The villagers were too caught up in their fear, in their prejudice, to listen to reason. Suddenly, a volley of arrows rained down on them, silver-tipped arrows aimed at Evan, at Rhys. The hunters. They had been hiding in the shadows, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Evan reacted instinctively, her wolf senses on high alert. She dodged the arrows, her movements swift and graceful, her fur bristling with adrenaline. She shielded Rhys with her body, protecting him from the deadly projectiles. Rhys, though still weak, drew a silver dagger he had taken from the underground chamber, preparing to defend himself. The villagers, caught in the crossfire, scattered, screaming and panicking. The square, once filled with an uneasy silence, now erupted in chaos. Evan roared, a sound of defiance, of rage, of heartbreak. She had tried to protect them, to warn them, but they had rejected her. And now they were all in danger. She lunged at the shadows, attacking the unseen hunters, her claws and fangs tearing at them, forcing them to retreat. She was a creature of the wild, of the moon, of pure, untamed power. But she was outnumbered. There were too many hunters, their silver weapons a constant threat. She felt a sharp pain in her side, an arrow piercing her fur, drawing blood. She stumbled, her legs weakening, her vision blurring. She had fought bravely, but she was losing. The hunters were closing in, their faces filled with a cold, ruthless determination. Rhys, seeing Yvance's distress, fought his way towards her, his dagger flashing in the moonlight. He reached her side, placing himself between her and the hunters, protecting her with his own body. He whispered, his voice urgent.
Run.
Save yourself. But she wouldn't leave him. She wouldn't abandon him to the hunters. She was moonbound. She was Leakin. And she was his mate. She stayed and prepared to fight. The howling wind seemed to echo her despair and her determination. Chapter 17. The Gathering Storm of Secrets. Evan, wounded but resolute, stood beside Rhys, her wolf form a beacon of defiance against the encroaching darkness. The hunters, emboldened by her injury and the villagers' fear, pressed their attack, their silver weapons gleaming menacingly in the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of blood, both hers and theirs, and the acrid tang of wolfsbane. Rhys, fighting with a ferocity born of desperation, managed to hold them back, but he was weakening, his earlier injuries taking their toll. Evan knew they couldn't hold out much longer. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and trapped in a village that had turned against them. Suddenly, a voice, clear and strong, cut through the chaos.
Stop.
It was Elder Silas, his face pale but determined, standing between the hunters and the lichens, his arms outstretched. The fighting momentarily ceased, the hunters hesitating, surprised by his intervention. The villagers, huddled in the shadows, watched with a mixture of fear and hope. "This is madness," Silas cried, his voice echoing in the square. "These are our neighbors. Evan is one of us. She has protected us. She has fought for us." He turned to address the hunters, his voice filled with righteous anger. "You are the intruders here. You are the ones who bring violence and death. Leave this village. Leave us in peace." The hunters, led by the one Evan had wounded in the library, his face now bandaged, but still twisted with hatred, sneered at Silas's words. "The old fool speaks nonsense," the lead hunter said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The lichens are a blight upon this earth. They must be eradicated. And you, old man, will not stand in our way." He raised his hand, signaling his men to attack. But before they could move, something unexpected happened. A low growl, a rumble of thunder, echoed through the square, not from Evan, but from the villagers. Slowly, hesitantly, the villagers began to emerge from the shadows, their faces no longer filled with fear, but with a growing determination. They had seen Evan fight, had seen her protect Rhys, had seen her defend their village, even after they had rejected her. They had seen the truth. Old Mrs. Henderson, clutching her rosary beads, stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "She's right," she said, her gaze fixed on the hunters. "Evan is one of us. She's different. But she's not a monster." Young Thomas, the blacksmith's son, his face still pale but his eyes filled with a newfound respect, stepped forward, his hunting knife now pointed at the hunters, not at Evan. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "She's protecting us." One by one, the other villagers joined them, forming a protective circle around Evan and Rhys, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and courage. They were armed with whatever they could find: torches, farming tools, kitchen knives, but they were united, standing together against a common enemy. The hunters, surprised by this unexpected turn of events, hesitated. They had anticipated an easy victory, a swift eradication of the lichens, But they had not expected resistance from the villagers. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and surrounded. The lead hunter, his face contorted with rage, snarled at the villagers. "You fools!" he cried. "You don't understand. These creatures are dangerous. They will turn on you. They will destroy you." But his words fell on deaf ears. The villagers had made their choice. They had chosen to stand with Evan, with Reese, with the Lycans. Evan, seeing the villagers' support, felt a surge of hope, of gratitude. They had rejected her at first, but they had come around. They had seen the truth. They had accepted her. She let out a howl, a sound of triumph, of unity, of belonging. It was a howl that echoed through the village, a howl that reached the surrounding forest, a howl that called to the other Lycans, a howl that signaled the turning of the tide. The hunters, realizing that they had lost, retreated, disappearing into the shadows. Their mission failed. The village of Whispering Pines, once divided by fear and prejudice, was now united, standing together against a common enemy. The storm, both literal and metaphorical, had gathered, but it had also revealed a hidden strength, a hidden unity within the community. The secrets of the Moonbound, of the Lycans, were no longer hidden, but out in the open, a challenge and a promise. What repercussions would this alliance bring? Chapter 18. Ancient Curses and Soul Bonds. The immediate threat of the hunters had passed, but the aftermath of the confrontation left the village of Whispering Pines in a state of uneasy calm. The villagers, having witnessed Avant's transformation and her fierce defense of their home, were slowly beginning to accept her, to understand the truth about the Lycans, about their own history. However, the night's events had taken a toll. Avant's wound, though treated by Silas, was still painful, a constant reminder of the battle, of the silver's burning touch. Reese, too, was recovering, his strength slowly returning, but the emotional scars, the memory of his capture, and Avant's near-fatal encounter, ran deep. They retreated to Silas's cottage, the bound hunter still under his watchful eye, a silent testament to the complexities of their situation. The small cottage, usually a place of quiet contemplation, now felt like a sanctuary, a refuge from the storm that had raged outside. As the adrenaline faded, a deeper conversation emerged, delving into the ancient lore that Silas had been researching, the lore that connected Evan and Reese, the lore that held the key to their future. "The prophecy," Silas said, his voice grave, his gaze fixed on Evan. "It speaks of a moonbound woman, a woman born under a lunar eclipse who will possess the power to unite the Lycan clans. But it also speaks of a curse." Evan felt a chill run down her spine. A curse. Another layer of complexity, another obstacle to overcome. "What curse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas hesitated, his expression troubled. "The curse of the Silver Crescent," he said softly. "It's an ancient curse, placed upon the Lycan bloodline by the hunters, centuries ago. It's designed to weaken them, to make them vulnerable to silver, to drive them mad." Evan looked at her wrist, at the mark of the Silver Crescent, the mark that had appeared after the eclipse, the mark that signified her Lycan heritage. It was a symbol of power, but also a symbol of vulnerability. "Is there a way to break the curse?" she asked, her voice filled with a desperate hope. Silas nodded slowly. "The prophecy speaks of a soul bond," he said, his gaze meeting Reese's. "A bond between the moonbound woman and a powerful alpha. A bond that can heal the curse, that can restore the Lycans to their full strength. A soul bond." Evan felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. She already felt a connection to Reese, a powerful bond that had been forged during their trials, a bond that had helped her to transform, to fight, to survive. But a soul bond, it was something more, something deeper. Reese, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and concern, reached out, his hand gently cupping Avant's cheek. "We already share a bond, Evan," he said softly. "The moon has brought us together. Our destinies are intertwined." Evan leaned into his touch, seeking comfort in his presence, in his strength. She trusted him, relied on him, felt a connection to him that she had never felt with anyone else, not even with Thomas, her beloved husband. But what does it mean? She asked, her voice trembling. A soul bond? What do we have to do? Silas explained the ritual, an ancient ceremony that would have to be performed under the next full moon, a ceremony that would bind their souls together forever. It was a commitment, a sacrifice, a merging of their beings, a sharing of their strengths, their weaknesses, their destinies. The thought was overwhelming. To be bound to another person, for eternity, to share their soul, their very essence. It was a terrifying prospect, but also strangely alluring. Evan looked at Rhys, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw in his eyes a reflection of her own uncertainty, her own fear, but also a deep, unwavering love. A love that had grown out of their shared trials, their shared struggles, their shared destiny. She made her decision. She would embrace the soul bond. She would embrace her destiny. She would embrace Rhys. I'm ready, she said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting his. I will do it. Rhys smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face, making him appear even more handsome, more human. Then let us prepare, he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. The next full moon is not far off, and our destiny awaits. The ancient curse, the soul bond, it was all intertwined, a complex tapestry of fate and free will. Evan, the once an ordinary woman, was now at the center of it all, her life irrevocably changed, her future uncertain, but her heart filled with a love that transcended the fear, the danger, the unknown. The looming question was, would this soul bond be enough? Chapter 19. A choice between two worlds. The days leading up to the next full moon were filled with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Evan and Rhys, guided by Silas, prepared for the soul bond ritual, studying the ancient texts, gathering the necessary materials, learning the intricate steps of the ceremony. The village of Whispering Pines, having witnessed Avant's transformation and her defense against the hunters, was slowly coming to terms with the presence of lichens in their midst. The initial fear and prejudice were gradually being replaced by a cautious acceptance, a grudging respect, and even a flicker of hope. Evan, though still adjusting to her lichen nature, found herself embracing her new identity, her new powers. She spent hours in the forest, practicing her shifting, honing her senses, learning to control the wolf within. She was no longer just Evan the Corbin, the widow, the gardener. She was moonbound, lichen, protector of her village, and mate to Rhys. The bond between her and Rhys deepened with each passing day. They were inseparable, their connection growing stronger, their understanding of each other becoming more profound. They shared their thoughts, their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They were two souls, drawn together by the moon, destined to be together. But the impending soul bond ritual also brought with it a sense of finality. It was a commitment, a sacrifice, a merging of their beings, a choice between two worlds: the human world Evan had always known, and the lichen world she was just beginning to understand. One evening, as they were walking through the forest, the setting sun casting long, dramatic shadows across the valley, Evan voiced her doubts, her fears. Rhys, she said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. What if I lose myself? What if the wolf takes over? What if I become a monster? Rhys stopped, turning to face her, his golden eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. You will never lose yourself, Evan, he said softly. You are stronger than you realize. You have a good heart, a strong spirit. The wolf is a part of you, but it is not all of you. You are both, human and lichen. And that is what makes you special. His words reassured her, easing her fears, strengthening her resolve. But she still had doubts. The villagers, she said, her voice trembling. They accept me now. But what about after? After the soul bond? After I'm bound to you? Will they still see me as Evan? Rhys sighed. I don't know, Evan, he admitted. There will always be fear. Always be prejudice. But we will face it together. We will show them that lichens are not monsters, that we can live in peace, side by side. He looked at her, his gaze intense, his voice filled with a quiet determination. This is our choice, Evan, he said softly. To embrace our destiny, to unite our two worlds, to create a future. A future where humans and lichens can coexist. A future where love can conquer fear. His words resonated deeply within her. It was a noble goal, a daunting task, but it was worth fighting for. She was no longer just fighting for herself, for Reese, for the village. She was fighting for a future. A future where her two worlds, her human past and her lichen present, could merge, could create something new. She looked at Reese, her heart filled with a love that transcended the fear, the uncertainty, the unknown. She was ready. She was ready to embrace the soul bond. She was ready to embrace her destiny. She was ready to embrace Reese. I'm ready, she said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting his. Let's do it. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face, making him appear even more handsome, more human. He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle, and led her towards the clearing where they would perform the ritual, the full moon rising in the sky, a silent witness to their decision, to their love, to their future. The choice was made, the path was set. But the journey was far from over. What would the soul bond ritual entail, and what would be its consequences? Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts. The clearing was bathed in the silvery light of the full moon, the air thick with anticipation, with the potent energy of the lichen transformation. Silas had prepared the space meticulously, following the instructions in the Liber Luni, arranging stones in a circle, marking the cardinal directions with ancient symbols, placing herbs and crystals at specific points. Evan and Reese stood facing each other, their hands clasped, their eyes locked. They were both partially transformed, their lichen features visible, their human forms enhanced by the power of the moon. The villagers, having been invited by Silas to witness the ceremony, stood at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and hope. Silas, standing outside the circle, began to chant in the ancient lichen language, his voice resonating with power, with the weight of centuries of tradition. The words were foreign to Evan, but she understood their meaning, their intent. They were invoking the moon goddess, calling upon her to bless the soul bond, to unite two souls, to heal the curse. As Silas chanted, Evan felt a pull, a powerful force drawing her closer to Reese. She felt her heart beating in time with his, her breath synchronizing with his, her very essence merging with his. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, but also exhilarating. It was a feeling of completion, of becoming whole. Reese, his golden eyes burning with an intensity that matched the moon's glow, squeezed her hands, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. He was with her every step of the way, guiding her, supporting her, loving her. The chanting intensified, the air around them shimmering, distorting, as if the veil between worlds was thinning, as if the moon goddess herself was present, witnessing the ceremony. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a figure that Evan recognized instantly, the lead hunter, the one she had wounded in the library, the one who had escaped their grasp. He was accompanied by several other hunters, all armed with silver weapons, their faces filled with a cold, ruthless determination. Stop this abomination. The lead hunter roared, his voice echoing in the clearing. This union must not be allowed. The lichens must be destroyed. The villagers gasped, their fear returning, their newfound acceptance of Evan and Reese threatened by this sudden intrusion. Silas, his chanting interrupted, stepped forward, his voice firm and commanding. You have no place here, he cried. This is a sacred ceremony. Leave us in peace. But the hunters ignored him, their eyes fixed on Evan and Reese, their weapons raised. They advanced towards the circle, their intent clear to disrupt the ritual, to kill the lichens, to end the threat. Evan and Reese, their hands still clasped, their bond strengthening, prepared to defend themselves. They were outnumbered, but they were not alone. The villagers, overcoming their initial fear, stepped forward, forming a protective circle around them, their makeshift weapons raised in defiance. A battle erupted, a clash between humans and hunters, between fear and acceptance, between hatred and love. The clearing, once a place of peace, of sacred ceremony, became a battlefield, a scene of chaos and violence. Evanna and Rhys, their combined strength amplified by their burgeoning soul bond, fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. They were a force to be reckoned with, their movements synchronized, their attacks coordinated, their love for each other a shield against the hunter's hatred. The villagers, though untrained and ill-equipped, fought bravely, their loyalty to Evanna and Rhys, their newfound understanding of the Leaken world, giving them courage. The battle raged, the outcome uncertain. But amidst the chaos, amidst the violence, something shifted. The soul bond ritual, though interrupted, had not been broken. The connection between Evanna and Rhys, strengthened by their shared struggle, by their shared love, by their shared destiny, continued to grow, to deepen, to complete. They felt it, a surge of power, a merging of their souls, a union of their beings. They were no longer two separate individuals, but one, a single entity, bound together by the moon, by love, by destiny. With this newfound power, they turned the tide of the battle. They fought with a strength and a skill that surpassed anything they had possessed before. They defeated the hunters, driving them back into the shadows. Their mission failed. The clearing fell silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the combatants, the soft whisper of the wind through the pines, the gentle glow of the full moon. Evanna and Rhys, their bodies bruised and battered, but their spirits soaring, stood together, their hands still clasped, their souls united. They had faced the final confrontation, the ultimate test of their love, of their bond, of their destiny. And they had won. The villagers, witnessing the power of their union, the strength of their love, cheered, their fear replaced by awe, by respect, by acceptance. The two worlds, human and Leaken, had finally merged. A new future had been born, but what would it hold? Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the strength of the soul bond, to the power of love, to the possibility of coexistence. The village of Whispering Pines, once a haven of fear and prejudice, transformed into a beacon of hope, a place where humans and lichens lived side by side, in peace and harmony. Evanna and Rhys, their souls intertwined, their love unwavering, led their community with wisdom and compassion. They taught the villagers about the Leaken world, about the ancient traditions, about the power of the moon. They taught the lichens about the human world, about compassion, about understanding, about forgiveness. The mark of the silver crescent, once a symbol of a curse, became a symbol of unity, of strength, of hope. The curse itself, weakened by the soul bond, no longer held the same power, the lichens no longer as vulnerable to silver, their minds no longer as susceptible to madness. The hunters, their numbers diminished, their influence waning, retreated into the shadows, their mission a failure. They still posed a threat, but a diminished one, their hatred no match for the combined strength of humans and lichens, united by love, by understanding, by a shared destiny. Evan no longer just Evan the Corbin, the widow, the gardener, but Evan the Moonbound, Leaken Alpha, protector of her village, mate to Rhys, found a happiness she had never thought possible. She had embraced her destiny, had faced her fears, had found her home. Rhys, his golden eyes filled with a love that transcended time, that transcended worlds, stood by her side, his strength her strength, his heart her heart, his soul hers. They often walked through the forest together, hand in hand, their Leaken forms shifting effortlessly, their human forms enhanced by their bond. They would run under the full moon, their howls echoing through the valley, a song of love, of unity, of freedom. The village of Whispering Pines, nestled deep within the valley, surrounded by the towering pines, continued to whisper its secrets, its stories, its magic. It was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the impossible was possible, where love had conquered fear, where two souls had become one. And as the moon cast its silvery glow over the village, over the forest, over the two figures standing hand in hand, their love a beacon in the darkness, a promise of a brighter future, a testament to the enduring power of the human and Lycan spirit, it was clear that their journey, though filled with trials and tribulations, had led them to exactly where they were meant to be. Together. Forever. The end.